Today, I'll be discussing and analyzing the speakership of Thomas O'Neill, which lasted from 1977 to 1987 and was the longest continuous speakership in United States history. And in this analysis, I will be discussing the ways in which Thomas O'Neill's leadership developed and solved congressional problems and weaknesses, and he did this through a multitude of ways. Thomas O'Neill came into his speaker's office, which was weak, and surrounded by a Congress which was still unruly and divided. His leadership and success would create new standards and meanings for the office and its relationship with both the legislature and the executive. He would also be the largest contributor to Congress's development into a formidable force. He also served as inspiration, and he still can serve as inspiration for future and current speakers. The 116th Congress saw nothing done besides COVID-19 relief packages and economic reform, mainly due to the fact that there's a deep partisan divide between Speaker Pelosi and Republican President Donald Trump. One thing that O'Neill knows, or knew. And the next Congress, the 117th, will be dealing with different, but to some extent even worse conditions, as while Speaker Pelosi will be dealing with a Democratic president, she will also be dealing with a slim majority in the House and a divided Democratic majority, as progressives and moderates begin to fight over not only how they lost their majority, but the policy initiatives in which they should push. And I say how they lost it. They have only a slim majority, and they are discussing and debating if the controversial issues involved in the summer of 2020 and in the election of 2020 had anything to do with that. And this created a deep divide between progressives and moderates. And Pelosi could learn a thing or two from Speaker O'Neill on this subject, because O'Neill both dealt with a Reagan administration, heavily conservative and Republican, and an unruly and divided Democratic majority, which was slim by 1980. To begin, we discuss Congress in the 60s and 70s. And Congress in the 60s was a waning power, as the governing class of chairmen and their committees was falling to an individualistic sort of House and Senator. The individualism within Congress generally hurt it. There was no cohesion, and there was no legislative pushes that were at least bogged down by one individual after another. And this lack of cohesion meant that the executive could merely take the powers which are afforded to Congress. And I say take, but it was almost a 50-50 split of when Congress would give these powers over to the executive because they could not make up their own mind. And having one person, one force to decide rather than a whole body of people was easier. However, this encouraged the executive to begin taking powers away from Congress when they didn't agree with Congress's reaction. And this culminated in the Nixon administration taking over select appropriations powers from a confused Congress. Now, congressional leaders tried to negotiate and fight against this takeover, but they failed due to a lack of cohesion and a lack of agreement over policy issues. And this failure was a learning point for all those in Congress, and specifically the House, as they began to realize that the individualism that they had would not last, and they would become merely a tradition at some point, like the Roman Senate was during the reign of the Roman members. And that is why there was a slight reduction of independence for members, as a great resurgence of power within Congress swelled up by the mid-60s or mid-70s. Congress began to unite. While it was shaky, they began to unite together, and their actions were numerous, including but not limited to the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974, which totally took back the powers in which Nixon had taken back in the Battle of the Budget. They also brought upon the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which limited the president from sending U.S. troops to foreign lands, and finally, and likely the most important, the Nixon impeachment, which congressional leadership found to be essential to maintaining the democracy. However, there was still division, as the Democratic majority, which had been serving Congress for decades, was split between old conservative Southern Democrats and a new progressive wing within the party, found in the Northeast and Midwest. But for now, let us move to our character. Tip O'Neill developed his political mind during the era of the New Deal. Elected to the Massachusetts State House in 1936, he ran on the platform of supporting the New Deal. And he developed a sense of what old politics were like. The old machine politics, that is, where constituents would routinely come to their representative or ward boss asking for jobs, money, or food. And Tip O'Neill found this while he was serving in North Boston in the late 30s and all throughout the 40s. He found that this was still happening, and it's developed his political skills because he learned about an open door policy where anyone could come in and ask him anything, and he'd be willing to help, which would make a lot of friends and make a lot of people happy. He also learned the old school politics of backslapping. And while I say it's old school, it still happens today. But back then, it was much more vibrant, as money was sent, money that was needed by one congressman or representative in this case would handily be just given, signed off by another. Votes for money. Backslapping helped O'Neill rise up in the leadership of the Massachusetts State House, and it culminated in him being chosen as the first Democratic Speaker of the House of Massachusetts in 1949. And he had developed his political skills so much to where he began a fruitful relationship with the Kennedy family, which led to him being elected to John Kennedy's old U.S. House seat in 1952, as JFK began to run for the U.S. Senate in Massachusetts. In Congress, O'Neill began climbing the ladder. He was a reliable vote, yet he was stagnant in his place in leadership. Among the whip system and in the Rules Committee, he found that his power within the speakership was nothing compared to what he could do in Congress, but he couldn't at the point because he was not Speaker of the U.S. House. And so this power was essential to him, but also he was an independent voice, as the greatest thing that would push him towards the speakership was not a friendship made, a deal made, or a negotiation, but rather a dissent, one lone dissent. And that lone dissent was his rejection in 1967 of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which was wild by that point because of the fact that Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Texas Democrat, was president, the leader of O'Neill's party, and O'Neill was finally going against him, a remnant of the individualistic Congress of the late 60s, but this encouraged and made progressive Democrats happy, younger ones, and they pushed him to move up through the leadership, and he did, moving through being chief whip to becoming majority leader. And during his time as majority leader, he would be the highest ranking member to call for the impeachment of President Nixon. And finally, to him being elected to the speakership in 1977. Now, when O'Neill became the speaker, there were three fundamental things wrong with Congress, and the House specifically, that are fundamental and endemic weaknesses within Congress. They are: 1, a hierarchical structure; 2, a lack of conditional party government; and 3, an extremely decreased legislative productivity. And O'Neill would have a multitude of ways in which to solve each of these problems. For the lack of a hierarchical structure, O'Neill developed the strategy of inclusion, as he called it, which gave lower members of the House and of the Democratic majority inclusion into the winnings and the success of the leadership's policies. And he did this by expanding the whip system. Back in the beginning of O'Neill's time as Speaker, there were only about 24 whips in charge of a Democratic majority that ranged to 284. And he developed it to include a lot of younger and junior members of the House majority. And by the time that he was leaving the speakership in 1987, almost a quarter of all members of the Democratic majority were a part of the whip system in some way, shape, or form. And this was incredible because it gave lower members an opportunity to be involved directly with the policy making. Incredible. He also, O'Neill that is, brought back his open door policy, which he had learned as a state rep in Massachusetts, to Congress. And so any junior member could come into his office and ask for something, ask for advice, and he would try to help in any way. And this permitted a hierarchical structure within the House. But he also needed conditional party government. And he also had a problem on his hand. The Conservative Democratic Forum, a group of Democratic House members who were upset with the progressive takeover of the Democratic Party, had threatened O'Neill, saying that if they didn't have their choice committeeships and choice committee chairmanships, they would revolt and either vote for Reagan's policies or just dissent with any of the policies brought upon by the Democratic majority. And so O'Neill made this deal in order to secure their vote, and he did, to some extent, secure their vote. But also, in this regards, he did this for a lot of people. He gave chairmanships, gave committee assignments to a lot of people through positive inducements, and this encouraged people. He would help those who had helped him, he would help those who needed his help through these assignments, and they were greatly appreciated and developed loyalty for O'Neill. And within conditional party government, you need a topic in which people can combine and be included. And for the Democrats, that came with Reagan's threats for Social Security, a hallmark of the New Deal, and something that both the conservative and progressive Democrats could rally behind. Thus, these two things led to the last portion, an increased productivity. However, O'Neill also developed the increased use of legislative task forces, who would shepherd legislation through the floor of the House and make sure that it got there in one piece. He also gave greater independence and power to the Rules Committee. However, there are two ways of getting legislation passed, and the second is pushing it through the executive. And O'Neill had to develop his own ways. of dealing with the conservative Reagan. For one, O'Neill developed his own bully pulpit. For those who don't know, a bully pulpit is when a politician uses his office and the stature of it and also using the media to profess his point of view and get the nation talking about certain things. And Reagan had been doing this beforehand. He was a master of this as an actor and as the governor of California. And with his calm voice and good and grandfatherly demeanor, he was able to control the airwaves with a conservative mindset for America. And O'Neill wanted to counter this, but he wasn't very available in the media as of yet. And no speaker was for that instance. But as O'Neill brought Chris Matthews into his staff, he began to appear more and more on television and display himself as the opposite of Reagan, the opposition to Reagan. And it worked like a success. It worked beautifully as O'Neill developed and became not only the symbol of opposition for Democratic House members, but also all the Democrats in the United States. Just to show you how the media was not covering, or maybe the speakership was not covering the media, here's a little statistic for you. O'Neill was on television for about 180 times in 1981 alone, compared to his predecessor, Speaker Albert, who was on television only 6 times in his 6-year tenure as Speaker of the House. O'Neill's bully pulpit, his counteraction to the great communicator, was also essential in creating a backdoor system, as both Reagan and, to a lesser extent, O'Neill used a strategy of trying to save face within the media and then coming together and negotiating on legislation behind closed doors. This created a way in which they could disagree and keep their constituents happy while also getting stuff done and getting bills passed. And this backdoor arrangement increased productivity. And an example of this increased productivity through this backdoor negotiation and agreement was the U.S. funding to the Soviet-Afghan War. Popularly seen in Charlie Wilson's war, it displayed how O'Neill guided Charlie Wilson, the Democratic House member from Texas, through funding the Afghan rebels during the Soviet-Afghan War, and how Reagan was involved in also supporting that, as Reagan and O'Neill came to good terms on the foreign policy stance of the United States. In conclusion, Speaker O'Neill was able to solve the endemic problems of Congress, which were a lack of hierarchical structure, a lack of conditional party government, and a lack of consistent legislative productivity. And through O'Neill's leadership, Congress gained power and developed efficiency, and the speakership became an opposition or supporting character to the executive. The speakership and Congress with it became powerful again and more coherent than in the 70s and 60s and even the 50s. This is all due to Speaker O'Neill and his differing abilities. He used to call himself an old dog who could learn new tricks, and he was. O'Neill used both his ability and knowledge that he had learned from the time in almost ward boss like politics in Massachusetts, and developed a more sensible route as well. A new one, which was encouraging younger members, developing systems within the House, and developing a relationship between him and the executive. And today's congressional leaders can learn from the skills that O'Neill had. They can. And we will see in the 117th Congress whether Speaker Pelosi can solve the endemic problem of a lack of a hierarchical structure, lack of constitutional party government, and a lack of consistent legislative productivity, which plagues her Congress. Thank you.